I'm very excited to be welcoming Sarah Nolet today to be presenting the Navigating a Future of Cross-Sectoral Forces. I just want to quickly mention as well, this report comes from our team at the Rural Futures team at AgriFutures. Our role is to really identify and understand and respond to national challenges and opportunities impacting Australian rural industries. So this is a really important part of that work. We also deliver the ENRI Forum, the Emerging National Rural Issues Forum, and that is about bringing together the RDCs to collaborate as well as the department and AIA and the NFF to be responding to and collaboratively developing research projects to be, changing and impacting some of these forces. This piece of work has been absolutely instrumental in helping to shape the thinking of that process, but it's been instrumental beyond that. It's had I would say, a profound impact on my thinking individually, but I know my broader team has as well, and other parts of AgriFutures have also really enjoyed this work. So personally, thank you, Sarah, for the impact it has had on AgriFutures, but I really want to be encouraging others to take the learnings and the findings to your work as well. We have heard that anecdotally from some partners that it already has been. We've got a survey at the end that we'll throw to that we really want to understand the value of this work. So we'd like to capture that later. I would love to introduce Sarah now, because that's why everyone is here to hear from Sarah directly. So Sarah, I'll throw to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jane. You guys can hear me? All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm not sure how many of you have or haven't read the report, but hopefully if you haven't, this webinar serves as motivation to go read it. And if you have, there's some new nuggets and insights throughout the webinar today, including a few interactive elements. It wouldn't, be horizon scanning, and in the spirit of horizon scanning, if we weren't translating this work into your context to help you think differently, work differently, and use some of these insights. So I wanted to start with a bit of a question. Might seem easy at first. When you see these images, what year do you think of? Maybe put it in the chat if you have an idea. Get the interactivity going. Someone's got to pick a year. Right, 2020, that makes a lot of sense. Exactly, yes, maybe some 21, lockdown memories, etc. And so for most, they would think of COVID. But for about 20,000 people in the world, they see these images and they actually think of 2010. And that's because in 2010, a game designer and forecaster named Jane McGonigal invited these 20,000 people to imagine a future pandemic. So 10 years before COVID, they were invited into a simulation and to live through this future scenario as if it was real. And in this fictional pandemic, it was respiratory, it originated from China, it spread globally to infect millions. And the people were asked things like, would you wear a mask? When would you adhere to those rules or not? They were asked to write journal entries about getting quarantine orders and were asked to think about whether they'd violate them. They were asked to think about what they would do for childcare and would they be able to keep their jobs. They were asked to imagine supply chain disruptions and overlaying misinformation campaigns and what would happen if during lockdowns there were bushfires and heat waves. They didn't just think about the facts of this future, they actually pictured themselves living it. And neurologically, this has an impact of engaging more parts of the brain and helping people understand what something could actually mean. So what happened for those 20,000 people when the actual pandemic hit 10 years later? Many of them wrote to Jane and told her what happened to them. Things like, I already worked through this, or we're ready to go, time to start social distancing. The scenario planning that they did 10 years beforehand actually increased their mental resilience. And they identified some surprising things that turned out to be true, like how religious gatherings would be an issue because it would be one of the really compelling reasons to break quarantines, or how childcare would be an issue because many women would have to stop working and there wouldn't be childcare or work from home. Now, Jane has been interviewed a bunch for this work and wrote a great book called Imaginable that has some really practical work on futures thinking and horizon scanning. What I love about this in particular, though, was that the original purpose wasn't to get the scenario right. Incredibly, they got a lot of things right, but it was actually to help people be more flexible in their thinking and more broadly to take actionable steps today to create the lives and careers and industries and futures that they want to live in. But Jane also said, looking back about, getting it right, she sees scenario planning now as also a tool for advocating for policy, for how our companies, for how our research organizations more broadly work, to actually translate some of the lived experience into actionable advice. And that's really been key for me and for this work, and why when AgriFutures Australia approached Tenacious about doing this horizon scanning project, we were really excited, because for ag R&D in Australia in particular, we've been really good at focusing on the now, but it's also critical to look ahead and to keep building on the horizon scanning work that the RDCs and the research system has been doing. Not always, and not at the expense of the challenges for today, and not even necessarily to predict the future. That's not the point, to get it right, but to ensure that as a system, we're ready and can in fact shape what's ahead. Because right now we can take actions today that might make an impact on how things unfold and might make us more resilient, just like the people who went through the pandemic scenario were more mentally resilient when the actual pandemic did arise. So the report, we worked on here, had a really large cross-sectoral element with all of the RDCs, the NFF, the department involved. There was a number of workshops, and we had a great cross-sectoral steering committee meeting, and a lot of consultations across different participants. In particular, we developed a huge long list of forces and then prioritized down to these 10 that we looked at that were less covered, more provocative, more cross-sectoral. And we built out 4 scenarios. Now, they weren't fully built out like the pandemic and in the book that I just talked about, but they are narrative in nature to hopefully help readers and you guys here today really feel what that future would be like. So I won't go through the report over this webinar in every single force, but I do want to start with one of the scenarios and ask you guys some prompts to kind of put yourself into that future. And then we'll talk about a number of the forces and some of the key so whats for each of them. So that will be the plan today. And starting with, I guess, building on that spirit of what these game designers did 10 years or 15 years ago now for the pandemic, as I talk through Ava, in this case's day, in 10 years in the future, in 2034, I want you to think about your life in this future. Where are you? Where do you wake up? What have you had for breakfast? What would your day look like? When this scenario happens, who might you call? How would you feel? What would happen throughout your day as we go through Ava's day? Just to make that even more specific, again, 2034, let's call it a Tuesday. And let's say that it's winter. Just to really think about, like, when you wake up, are you cold? Are you hot? What would you wear? Let's get really specific as we go through this. All right, so Ava, the Chief Risk and Information Officer at Farm Corp, begins her day earlier than usual. She's been on edge lately, with good reason. As she sips her coffee, she reviews the latest cybersecurity reports, because last night there was an attempted breach, a phishing scam that nearly exposed sensitive production data and next year's draft climate risk assessments. Thankfully, Ava's team responded quickly. They contained the threat before it could do any real damage. But Ava knows better than to let her guard down. The world she operates in is increasingly unforgiving. As her morning progresses, Ava's unease deepens. When the stock market opens, Farm Corp's shares suddenly nosedive. News breaks that a hedge fund has launched a public attack, shorting Farm Corp's stock. Their accusation? That Farm Corp has underestimated its exposure to climate risks in its recent disclosures. Panic spreads quickly. Investors begin pulling out, and funding, a crucial lifeline for daily operations, starts to evaporate. The fallout in the physical world is immediate. Processing plants grind to a halt. Bulk handlers and transportation lines, essential cogs in Farm Corp's supply chain, face operational paralysis. Contracts are suspended. Regulatory bodies intensify scrutiny, looking for any sign of noncompliance. And inside Farm Corp, anxiety ripples through the ranks. Employees are suddenly unsure about their job security, and whispers of doubt fill the halls. Later in the day, Ava ends up in the boardroom, laying out a plan to navigate this crisis. She stresses the need for greater transparency in climate risk disclosures and more robust risk management strategies. and better communication with investors and the public. The goal is clear: restore confidence in FarmCorp's future. But as the meeting wraps up and the weight of the day settles on her shoulders, Ava realizes the path ahead is fraught with challenges. She lives in a world where companies like FarmCorp must navigate not just the physical risks and challenges of agriculture, but the impact of digital risks, financial markets, climate disclosures, adversarial investors on her physical world. As Ava heads home, exhausted, she reflects on how her role has changed. Once centered on managing technological and operational risks, it is now far broader. So, curious how you guys thought about your days in this Tuesday in the winter in the future. And we'll put up a quick poll here. I'm really curious how you think in this world where, because of climate disclosures being mandated, because of increasing transparency through data collection about this information, there's an opportunity for an adversarial investor to actually short a stock and take advantage of a kind of arbitrage in the financial markets that has devastating consequences physically. Now, again, we're not saying this will happen, but if it did to an agricultural company with operations, across Australia, what areas of your work would be impacted? Go ahead and scan the QR code and then rank these options. Do you think you would really feel this increased pressure for transparency? Would you need to enhance more of your risk management? Would you be thinking more about stakeholder communication, as Ava was, operational adjustments, cybersecurity, or something else? And if it's something else, I'd love to see it in the chat. Give everyone a couple minutes to fill that out.
The responses are beaming in, Sarah, just so you know.
Perfect.
From the background.
All right, give us a sense what's popping up towards the top if you can see it.
Interestingly, stakeholder communication, and the next three are quite equal. So they are, at the minute, increased pressure for transparency, enhanced risk management, and operational adjustments, just coming in at third. We've got 25 responses. Still beaming in.
Fantastic. So again, I really appreciate you guys leaning into this scenario. I know it might seem kind of far-fetched, but again, the point isn't to get it right. The point is to say, if this did happen, and there's good evidence for a number of these forces that there's signals that they could be happening, things like climate disclosures, things like increased opportunity for remote sensing and data collection, things like cybersecurity obviously have been happening. But the point is to say, if this is even possible, what might we change now? Cybersecurity being a good example of actions we can take today as research organizations and as individuals to shore up our cybersecurity and insulate ourselves from, in this case, what started with a phishing attack. So hopefully an example where there's actions that are quite relevant today, even if this future doesn't fully come true. And maybe, in 10 years, hopefully not, there is one of these attacks and you all remember this moment and feel a little more resilient to it in the future. That would be the point of a lot of this work. So we'll kick on and go ahead, Emma. Yeah, tell us.
I was just going to let you know that 33 people have responded and the ranking hasn't changed. So stakeholder communication, increased pressure for transparency, enhanced risk management, operational adjustments, and then cybersecurity at the end.
Yeah, fantastic. It makes sense. I mean, the question that comes to my mind from that is, how much is stakeholder communication in the kind of comfort zone of actions we could take here versus some of the other ones might be more challenging to imagine because they're actually like a lot further from what we do today. And so that would be one of my provocations to follow up on that is, is it actually, you think, the most likely and important, or is it the most comfortable? And some of the other ones might be more uncomfortable, but actually more impactful as you think about possible consequences. Fantastic. So we will kick on and talk about a couple of the forces. Again, that was one of the scenarios that interlaid a few forces, climate-related financial disclosures coming to bear, cybersecurity, and increasingly accessible remote data and information. And here are 5 more. That makes 8. And then there's 2 that we won't get a chance to talk about today, but plenty, again, to dig into in the report. So as we go through these, I want you to think about how you react to these forces. Now, some of them might seem pretty obvious and you've heard of them before. Some of them might make you go, no way, I hate that. That's never going to happen. This project's stupid. Some of you might think, oh, that's a bit challenging, but maybe there's a bit of curiosity there. I just want you to pay attention to your responses to them and maybe challenge yourself to say, okay, we're not trying to get this right, but if this did happen, what would it mean? Would there be opportunities? Would there be risks? Would there be collaborations or unusual partnerships that I could take on? So that's my challenge to you as we go through them. The first one I want to talk about is the growing risks from climate, human, and animal interactions. Now, today, as we would have seen across agriculture globally, especially recently, the threats to human, animal, and plant health are absolutely on the rise. Things like increased global interconnectivity, people moving different places, just more global trade, changing climatic conditions are putting pressure on wild populations and changing the dynamics of where and when people and plants and animals interact. And of course, this is an expensive problem globally and locally, hundreds of billions of dollars spent managing damage. Fortunately, Australia is perceived as having a truly best-in-class, biosecurity detection and management system, especially for animals. But in this force, we really look at a future where biosecurity pressures become even more severe, and in particular, won't just impact one industry. In this future, we see evidence, and we've looked at signals where we'll have multiple intersecting complex plant, animal, and human issues all at once. And the issues will cross over between these groups. So, an example that we're seeing today, which is the image here on the screen, is with avian flu in the US, jumping from birds to cows to humans. I think as of this week, 14 cases in humans already arising. And what we need to start thinking about in this possible force coming to life is how we collaborate across what were previous silos, because we've thought about the human risk management, COVID, our national system on that, animal biosecurity, but as these things overlap and intersect, and technology advances to detect things, and climate changes to move them faster, how are our systems going to respond? And what's even more so is as our systems get better at responding, so too will our trade partners' systems. And is there even opportunities or challenges where others could take advantage of or detect and then take advantage of detecting biosecurity risks or threats in Australia? For example, making a claim about something that is or isn't true, or seeing something earlier than we see it and taking some kind of adverse trade action. So I think the big force here is really about this intersecting and breaking down of these silos across human, plants, and animals. But there's some big second and third order consequences potentially as we see these interactions getting more and more complex. And so what? Well, obviously biosecurity is something we're really proud of in Australia right now, and it's something that we do really well. Yet when we talk about this future, I think it can be or seem quite scary and all the negative outcomes. And so one of the challenges that we ask in the report is what opportunities could we create to continue to double down on that clean green image? What incentives could we tap into? What partnerships could we have? Maybe the improvements in technology or insurance or other commercial opportunities to help us shift to be more proactive, or the fact that companies have more corporate disclosures and responsibility, and are those kind of partnerships or things we could tap into? So that's the first force. The next one we look at is rise of artificial intelligence. And I love this one because in every workshop, every consultation we did, this was like everyone's number one vote, number one thing on people's minds. I don't know if it's just the prevalence of ChatGPT or just kind of where we're up to, but a lot of interest in this one. And really today we're seeing, generative AI, of course, like ChatGPT rise and have more and more potential to transform large data sets. So we don't just have information, but also insight and action. And one area we're seeing this in agriculture, and especially in Australia, is with autonomy. So companies like Swarm Farm Robotics that you see here, but many others being able to detect weeds versus crops, to move autonomously, to manage those weeds, to look at things like mowing and spreading and thinning as well. In the case of Swarm Farm, they sold over 100 robots. They've commercially farmed over 4 million acres. So this has moved from kind of theoretical lab-based into the real world. And we're seeing not just this new technology and not just even labor saving, but whole new ways of farming. and new business models, where we can think about different ways to do service, or we can think about new agronomy that's being unlocked by this. And so I think what we're starting to see is this shift from artificial intelligence moving from toys to tools and into like transformational technologies. And that's the kind of arc that we're on. And so in the future, everything from trade to marketing to input pricing to agronomic advice to production planning to security will have some form of AI embedded. For research organizations, how grants are written, how reports like this are written might be impacted by generative AI. Sectors that rely on information asymmetry, gatekeepers, trusted intermediaries, middlemen, absolutely AI will be able to change and shift that arbitrage. New business models, when we think about in the autonomy case, things like the input companies and the equipment companies starting to compete for different margins as equipment can actually take actions for management that previously only input companies and products could do. I think this is one of the most exciting areas for ag in Australia, where we could actually, again, see this as a huge opportunity to become, for example, a world leader in autonomy, to double down on capabilities. But we'll have to think about how we attract talent into this space, the implications for skills and capabilities, and new approaches, not just to technology, but also for policy. One of the possible examples would be, what if Australia and New Zealand had a autonomous agricultural zone that they created. The government underwrote the cost of issues. We prioritize that, and every company in the world building autonomy for agriculture wanted to come to Australia and New Zealand, or part of Australia. It could be a massive opportunity that we take advantage of, but would take that kind of concerted effort. Obviously, there's work that, for example, GRDC announced recently along these lines. So we're already seeing evidence of this starting to happen. And the big so what here is, for sure, that the technology is great, but if the humans can't use it, what does it matter? And so we need to think about how we attract and retain talent in the sector. We need to think about the user experience. Software in agriculture hasn't been that usable in many cases. So how does the interface change with artificial intelligence? Things like voice notes or different kinds of ways to interact with software, but also trust and reducing bias. And these are going to be really important cross-sectoral research opportunities as we see more and more AI come to play. The third one I want to talk about is climate refugees. Many of you will know what town or what city this is on the left. Hobart in Tasmania. Beautiful picture. I wish I had taken that. Fortunately, I didn't. But we're already seeing climate drive the relocation of people both within and offshore. So, for example, within Australia, thousands of people have already moved to Tasmania, citing reasons like more livable conditions or better production conditions. We also see displaced people coming to Australia, either, for, again, like true refugee reasons, or for different economic opportunities, displaced from other areas. And we might see previous accessible labor that we might have used in agricultural operations relocating elsewhere for other greater opportunities or accessibility reasons. And so one of the things that I think will come up here in the future is these second and third order consequences. So an example that we look at in the report is if we had a regional crop failure in Southeast Asia, say shrimp in Thailand had an issue, we would see a migration because there would be, thousands, if not millions, of hungry people that were otherwise reliant on that industry. But we'd also then have a shortage of that commodity. And so demand for substitutes might increase. And then who would supply that? And what would those trade routes look like? And how responsive would supply chains be? So again, the point here for sure is the movement of people and how do we think about culture and, inclusion, but also the second and third order consequences for supply chains, for demand, for food availability, and for the characteristics of who's demanding that food. And so local food demand patterns changing, local opportunities versus trade, and again, the social consequences. So some of the research questions, we provoke in this force is, how do we integrate climate refugees into rural and regional communities, especially around employment and agriculture opportunities? How can local government and industry work with the private sector to ensure those kind of inclusions and how we see this as an opportunity, not just as a risk or a cost. So hopefully you're getting a sense as we go, and we have 2 more forces to cover, of just how kind of different these areas are, from social and technical to trade related, and yet how they all have pretty different possible consequences and impacts for our sectors and our different industries. And so hopefully you remember those prompts of, like, how are you feeling about these forces? Is this sort of challenging you in different ways? Are there areas where you're more compelled to think about, or ones that you're resisting? And as we do the last 2, if there's ones where you're feeling a bit of resistance, I'll invite you to lean in a bit more and say, okay, we're not saying this is going to be true, but if it was, what might I need to think about that I'm resisting thinking about today? So this force is around geoengineering, and I'm not sure if any of you are sci-fi nerds like I am, but this actually occurs, and we didn't do this scenario fully, but I think it's one that's been talked about a lot globally. In this book, for example, climate change is threatening the death of tens of millions of people in India. And even though international protocols and consensus say geoengineering is illegal internationally, the Indian government will not incur the threat of these tens of millions of people dying and take action unilaterally by effectively dimming the sun. Now, this is a sci-fi book, but that technology does exist. You can do things like cloud seeding, and countries like China are already doing this. So that picture that you see is not a weapon, but is actually spraying a mix of sulfur dioxide and other chemical particulates into the atmosphere to effectively dim the impacts of the sun, to alter rain patterns, and to cool, in this case, or control the weather over cities during the Beijing Olympics. Now, China is planning to expand this. So again, this is a real thing that is possible now. But yet when we think about the future for agriculture, there's a ton of, impacts that I don't think we've explored. Things, like the ethical concerns, things like, if we alter offshore climatic norms, what does that do for production and for trade demands? How would that change our social and economic relations with our neighbors? If we did start to fundamentally transform land and seascapes, what would that mean for trade routes and for food demand and for all the other things we've talked about, like what technologies and production systems and people and living conditions are viable in different areas? So a number of research questions. In this case, I put quite a few of those up on the slide to give you a sense of what we do in quite a lot of detail in the report, is go through the specific research questions that we might consider as a result of these forces. And I think for this one in particular, what's really interesting is it's not really clear, like, of course, we would have big, tense public debates about how these technologies in the geoengineering space would be used, how they have been used, what has or hasn't been effective, what makes sense to do, where is the scientific versus ethical lines. But does agriculture have a seat at that table? Like, do rural industries, in what capacity, have any ability to influence or sway decision making? And yet they will be impacted quite a lot if we're altering the climate. So I think that was one of the big so whats for me of this force is, yes, this might be happening, or it's easy to say, no, it'll never happen. But if it did, do we even have a seat at the table? Yet it would have quite a big impact on regional sectors. And finally, perhaps my favorite force, because I do see a lot of evidence of this happening, is what we call from incremental to systemic changes in production systems. Now, today, research and development largely functions along commodity lines. And I know we have great examples of cross-sectoral efforts and exactly like this project, but generally the system is set up along commodity lines. And we are starting to see shifting and blurring, largely kind of due to producers seeking diversification opportunities. We talked about energy and livestock production. This is an example of custom-made solar panels that can go high enough so that cattle can go under them. The cattle get the benefit of the shade, and there's another revenue stream from the solar. And so we're seeing that diversification opportunity come in. In the future, when we see more and more systemic changes, I think that raises really new question. So not just incremental changes, add one new revenue stream, or shorten the season a little bit, or there's one more risk here or there, but actual full systemic changes like producing entirely new crops or commodities, entirely new different ways, social media fueled activism, threatening entire industries, increases in land value or competition for land, pushing existing industries out, entirely new revenue streams that didn't even exist previously, or crops or commodities completely shifting locations into different areas. And you can imagine whole new industries popping up. The picture you see here is a company called Terviva that uses pongamia trees to produce sustainable aviation fuel, and also for culinary oil and protein. And now Australia and other countries have looked at a lot of these new crops and said, okay, maybe there's emerging industry programs, but sometimes building whole new value chains, it's capital intensive. Is there enough demand? Is there enough, R&D support? Maybe it doesn't make sense. And we've seen things sort of fall over. What I think is really interesting about this case is they specifically have targeted areas where there's been big challenges with citrus greening in the US. And so there's this kind of overlapping existential threat for producers where they have a catalyst to think about a whole new system. And I think we'll see more of those kind of drivers for not just incremental, but whole systemic changes in production systems like this company is looking at in the US. And that raises some big questions for R&D. Not only how do we make our existing systems continue to be viable and resilient, technology, genetics, abiotic stress, like all of those kinds of solutions we absolutely need to be continuing to develop, but also how to enable the adoption of whole new crops and products. And what will that mean for new funding models? What will it mean for new farming identities? If I'm a first generation solar producer and a second generation carbon producer and a fifth generation mixed farmer, like, what does that look like for identities? What are the psychological barriers or research elements to explore there? As we see these shifts, will we have stranded assets that seem like risk, but could also be opportunities to leverage new technologies like local green energy production or new ways to fill processing gaps? And yet we'll need to tackle this kind of current paradigm of commodity-based segmentation and think about when and how that does and doesn't make sense. So again, those were 5 of the forces. We touched on the other 3. Here's the 10 that we talk about in the report. We didn't talk about rare earth mineral demand in very much detail, or global conflict and deglobalization, but there are plenty of insights, hopefully, to dig into in the report. As I went through these, I did ask you guys to think. And so I will ask one more question here in terms of a poll. As you've heard about these forces and thought about the scenario we did in the beginning, how likely are you to change your approach or your priorities in your work? And I'll have you scan that QR code and have a think about it. It isn't a test. We won't track the results, but just curious, did anything here sort of strike a chord or cause you to jot down something that you might take an action on in the near term or in the midterm here as a result?
We've got results flowing in, Sarah. We're up to nearly 20.
Nice.
Yeah.
I had a real question mark whether I put in undecided, because I feel like a lot of people will pick undecided, but we'll see if my hypothesis there was right.
It's a comfortable place, isn't it, that one? Not committing. However, you'll be pleased to know that there are people who are well and truly committing here. There's still a few streaming in, but at this point we've got the top rank, of course, being the somewhat likely to change your approach or priorities in your work, and the second is very likely, and then undecided is coming in at third.
That's fantastic. Either you guys all really like getting top marks on your on your responses, or it's had an impact. Hopefully the latter. If anyone came up with something they are thinking about changing or an insight, I'd love to see it in the chat, and hear just about, a light bulb moment, maybe that from reading the report or hearing this or imagining that scenario of something you might take on. But overall, again, those are the 10 forces. There's 4 scenarios, one of which we went through at the beginning. And just a massive thank you to all of the people that participated in helping us to build out these forces and scenarios. And of course, to AgriFutures Australia for supporting the work. Super excited to hear any questions and hopefully get into a little bit of discussion or hear some of those insights in the chat about what might change.
Thanks, Sarah. That was fabulous. While people are coming up with their questions, I thought a little fun fact that we should share is that given AI was ranked number 1, that we decided to do the images within the report were all generated by AI. So keep that in mind as you're flipping through it, because they've come up in a pretty fun way, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not this one, but I'll show you, like, just to flip back. So that one, which I think is in the report, and this one, yeah, those are all AI generated. Where's one? This one as well. Yeah, so fun fact.
Sarah, there's a question in the chat from Mark.
Oh, yep. So thanks, Mark. How or when do you see food tech like cellular agriculture and precision fermentation in the future? So definitely one of the contexts in which we looked at that in this report was around that from incremental to systemic shifts in production systems. So you can imagine, I mean, the kind of example that gets talked about a lot is moving from a land-based, outdoor livestock-based system for production of meat to, indoor cellular ag-based, same thing with precision fermentation for milk. And so that would be like a kind of quintessential example of that's not an incremental shift, that's a systemic shift in production systems. So I think that's exactly where that fits. And one of the examples that, again, can seem kind of black and white, but we've seen evidence of dairy companies and dairy cooperatives partnering with precision fermentation companies, or dairy farms looking at growing oats to not only have feed for cattle, but as another revenue stream if they could sell that oats into the same dairy processor for oat milk. So some of these things seem like black and white, but actually could blur and overlap in quite interesting ways. But that's where that one fits.
Right. Next question is from Clancy. Do you envisage the use of AI to pressure test potential scenarios and outcomes, which can then be used to develop roadmaps to respond to these?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the range of ways that we already are and will use AI is going to continue to increase. One example I can give you specifically from this project is, all of you have been in rooms where there's Post-it notes and we're ranking things and we're prioritizing. But what we did for one of the workshops we ran was gave people a prompt, and then they did their kind of brainstorming in a group, and then recorded voice notes and texted them. And we had AI process all of that data. So there was no collection of the Post-it notes and having to read that after. And it forced people to actually get into that narrative mode of I'm a producer in this moment, I'm thinking of these challenges, I'm dealing with these things. And so we had the AI, process that. So it wasn't exactly pressure testing the outcomes, but I think a novel use of how these technologies can play a role in the research process, and in qualitative interviews and data collection and data synthesis as well. And absolutely in terms of pressure testing these outcomes, we did put some of the scenarios in ChatGPT and say, how would we tweak this? How could we make it more provocative? Here's the writing we did on the forest. What might this change? And so we actually use that as a tool to sort of push and prod the research in different directions as well. So absolutely.
There's a couple more questions here that I might merge together. So from Matthew Peacock and Robert Smiths, can you talk about how we went about choosing the 10 forces, and particularly the rise of misinformation not being in there and that kind of interest group influence on decision making?
Absolutely. So it was quite a broad consultation process with cross-sectoral participants. So definitely RDCs, and we ran a workshop with RDCs in person. That was where we used that AI, as I mentioned, for data capture, and then a number of small group and one-on-one consultations, and basically built out a long list. And so they're in the back of the report, but 48 or something, forces that were on that long list. I believe misinformation is on there. It definitely was covered in detail in the prior report we did on future forces in 2019, 2020. And there was some follow-up work that AgriFutures funded on misinformation and a toolkit and things like that we are fortunate enough to work on. So if that's an interest area, definitely some good research went into that. The way we prioritized from the long list to the short list was by building like a filter criteria. Those are things I mentioned earlier, like how novel is this? Like, has there been prior research done? Because things that have been covered before might not make as much sense. Is it cross-sectoral, like likely to have an impact on multiple sectors? Is it something that's kind of in the purview of the research system? So that was another filter, because again, the report, while I think it's can be quite useful for producers or corporations. It's actually intended, like the research questions are for the agricultural research system. So we had a number of criteria like that. And there was a steering committee that oversaw this whole process with participants from a number of different RDCs, the NFF, AIA, and the department, who helped to develop that prioritization criteria and confirm the process from going to long list to short list. So yeah, that's how it worked. I think there were a few questions like, does cybersecurity make it or not? There's been some research on that, but it can have quite an impact. Should we break down, different areas of technology? So there was quite a bit of debate in there, but you can see that long list at the end for some of the forces that we didn't end up prioritizing.
Right, we've just had
Good
one
question.
more. Yep, go Sarah.
I just saw that. Sorry, Jane, saw that come through. So we did have quite a few participants from outside the ag and food system. And so the kind of research participant or the RDC system, obviously leveraging that experience and expertise. But then we had like the, head of AI for a tech company come along, or, examples of people from outside. I'll tell a quick story on that because I thought it was so impactful in my thinking. In this case, someone who'd been working as the head of AI for a tech company that's grown internationally and is taking a bit of a career break came along, and their reflection was, wow, in ag, there's so much of a more macroeconomic view. Like there's so much more focus on trade and trade policy, but maybe a bit less on the impacts of these particular technologies. And so that was, to me, such a good example of why you want these different perspectives in the room, because it really is sort of pushing and pulling in different directions, and getting people in different rooms than they've been in to challenge that thinking.
I think that's actually one of the biggest takeaways from the work for me, Sarah. It needs to be beyond ag, not just in this report, like anything we're doing, because when you think about the systemic issues that you mentioned throughout, ag can't be addressing those alone. So the conversation needs to always go beyond ag.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that obviously with the technology ones, like, is, ag going to be the developer of these technologies or the user or beneficiary of these technologies? And how do we make sure that Australian producers get access to that early? And what, policy and research conditions can we set to enable that? And those are, different kinds of partnerships and collaborations and incentives than, we might have been previously thinking about. So as the technology just develops so quickly. One of the people we actually spoke with and published some of it on our podcast, but we talked to the chief information officer at Syngenta, Feroz Sheikh, and about their AI experimentation to sort of ground some of this in realistic use cases. And he's the one actually that gave the example of the kind of toys, tools, and transformational technology framework of some of the work they're doing. But one of the things he said was, we thought at first that we should build our own foundational models because, we have technology capabilities, we have all this data, we should build our own model. And you realize that actually the existing foundational models far outperformed the ones that they had built. And so it was an example where ag maybe isn't best place to build it, but is best place to partner, and the things that they could bring to the table were the data and the ability to feed the data into the algorithms. And so there was a ton of work and value to be done, but it wasn't actually building it. And so I think that's some of the questions we'll need to be asking is like, what role do we play in some of this?
Absolutely. Okay, so there's another one from Robert Smits. We tend to talk about ag or regional communities, about the impact of the future, but the inclusion of non-ag and rural groups is vital. They often drive the narrative. Exactly right. Yeah, and the narrative's so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, I know I've been in rooms perhaps more recently in kind of climate conversations where just that view of farmers, it just like really struck me that it was so off base because I'm so much more frequently in ag rooms, and how much that can have an impact. But also when we looked at things like climate refugees and shifts in production systems, you know, two of the forces, shifting demographics, like where people live as a result of COVID, is changing the demographics of the workforce, but also land prices. And so is that shifting production regions? And so that's another driver of why we might see some of these shifts accelerating because of something unpredictable like COVID. And yet there's then talent in those areas that wouldn't have been there before. And so absolutely, it can't just be the current view of ag and how it currently operates.
Yeah, some wonderful opportunities for sure.
There might be time for a couple more questions. I will pull up, though, this survey from AgriFutures to hopefully get some feedback on this webinar. I don't know, Em or Jane, if there's anything you wanted to say about the survey.
Yeah, I briefly touched on it at the start, but we deliver this work with the aim of obviously informing the work we do, but we want it to go much broader than that. We want it to deliver value across the whole sector, particularly for our research community, and to be informing a lot of the, you know, to be providing the evidence base, to be informing a lot of the research and the decision making. But we want to hear from you if it is hitting the mark, if it is going to be delivering value, and if it is something that you will pick up and use in informing your strategic planning and whatnot. So we've got a quick survey here. We'd love you to jump in and fill it out so we can continue to provide that value. As you do that, we've got one more question from Clancy Patterson. How do we educate and increase awareness at the same pace that these forces develop?
I might be a bit cheeky and throw that back to the group here. If anyone has ideas for how they think that this work or this kind of thinking could have an impact in their sector or their careers or their jobs or rooms that they operate in, because we've obviously thought a lot about it doing the webinar, putting out some of the research on podcasts and newsletters and content, talking about integration with Evoke Ag. Like there's lots of conversations along those lines happening. But for sure, the wisdom of the crowd is something we want to tap into. So if others have ideas, I know I would value it. I'm sure the AgriFutures team would as well. Because yes, these things are moving quickly, and there will be more opportunities to bring in sort of different perspectives and to kind of increase awareness. I think one of the big ones for me in reflecting on that, Clancy, is the methodology is as, I think, important in many cases as the specific forces, because you can imagine any of the forces being sort of slightly tweaked, and, you know, there was a lot of debate about how they go, but this idea of really imagining yourself in that world where Ava is working at Farm Corp and the stock is shorted and it has impacts in the physical world, and then everyone's freaking out about climate related financial disclosures, and is there risk, and how is my data managed in cybersecurity, and what experts do I need, and is everyone competing for the same experts, and how am I going to get them, and how does the job change, and what skills are we going to get? Like that could very much exist and might have totally different consequences than we specifically talk about. And so how do we actually like embed that kind of mental resilience and that kind of thinking, to me, is one of the big takeaways, to just spend time really with the kind of toolkit as much as the forces.
Yeah, I think feel free to come off mute, anyone, if you've got something to contribute to this question. For me, like, I think we really need to up the ante on collaboration and being quite generous across the board in how we are sharing and disseminating information. And allowing each other to kind of grow our own capacity and take the whole industry on the journey together. But there will be a strong requirement for that kind of systems change approach that you touched on, Sarah, to enable that to happen. While people are maybe responding or thinking further on that one, there's another question in the chat here from Olivia Reynolds. You spoke about emerging industries, diversification of farming systems, but the challenge in Australia, such as capital layout, etc. The challenges in Australia, such as capital layout, etc. Given the pressures such as disease. Olivia, this is a very long question.
That's okay. I think I've got it.
Yeah, good.
Like, I think, tell me if I got this wrong, Olivia, I definitely come off mute, but like one of the issues is if we're imagining whole new value chains, there's like a capital investment that's going to be required, and who pays for that, and how do we justify it? And, you know, we also, my business lives in the venture capital world. Like, we don't want to spend equity dollars on that kind of infrastructure that, and yet debt or like bank finance, it's going to think it's too risky. So what fills that gap? I think one of the, like a couple of threads maybe to pull there, but one we did specifically look at as part of this report was everyone talked about onshore processing, labor challenges. And so we often got into like, well, we just can't do that. Well, we just have to offshore it. Well, labor's just too expensive. Well, capital's just too expensive. And so we flipped it and said, what would make it true that in 15 years, we've onshored a lot more processing? Like, we did it. Now make that true and work backwards. And that's actually some of the work behind the rare earth element force, because we said, well, Australia has existing access to these rare earth elements, some of which fuel autonomy, manufacturing, some of these advanced industries. If there was a policy, for example, around preferential access to those elements, could we have cheaper manufacturing, and would that open up new capabilities? So again, not saying that will happen, but we specifically looked at that to say, if that really is a barrier, how could we just make it true and then justify a way that it was true? And it actually wasn't that hard. Once we forced ourselves to do that, we said we have these existing capabilities. Yes, there'd be competition, but that might open up, access to electric vehicles in agriculture, and there might be other industries that get on board, and it might open new collaborations. And so all of a sudden we could have this existing, infrastructure and capability that would change labor economics that, oh my gosh, well, now we're in a completely different world than Australia's like been moving towards. And so, yeah, it's a fantastic question, because that was one of the ones that we looked at.
Wonderful. We've got time for probably one or two more. Aidan, I'm glad that you've popped one in here. How much influence will things like government-imposed carbon tax mechanisms have, or will government be largely powerless in shaping the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the easiest ways to make a scenario is to just like say that the government mandates it be true, and then you live in that world. But it is often a bit of a cop-out, because, how do you actually kind of build up from current signals that are happening now to, incentives to tailwinds that could create one of these futures? So we try not to just say government comes in over the top and does this. We do try to look, like I said, at signals. And so the existing research around not so much a carbon tax, but climate related financial disclosures, and how much SBTI commitments and scope 3 related reporting is definitely one of the signals around the climate related disclosures force. We also looked at the growth in carbon markets and these other kind of incentives that producers or landowners could tap into, but that also might create competition for land. And so that's another signal, like if those industries grow and there's other viable ways to service them that aren't production agriculture, does that lead to some of these systemic shifts in production, or does that, have different consequences? So we didn't specifically look at like one policy that would drive the scenarios, but we did look at policies and market predictions that are shaping these forces, or that are kind of signals or spotlights of what these forces could mean. But I think actually that goes to the methodology piece of like, if that's something that's on your mind, like, run that scenario, say like, okay, let's add this in, and ChatGPT is fantastic for that. Like take the work from the report, put it in, say this scenario exists, but there was also a carbon tax. What else would you need to know about the carbon tax to build a new scenario where this got taken into account, and just play with it. Because that we did do some of that kind of work to say like, what other threads around the edges could we pull based on signals we saw to kind of test the boundaries of these forces. So that's a tool set that you'd have at your fingertips to have a play. And if you do, please report back, because I'd love to hear.
We also used ChatGPT in some of the workshops, Sarah, didn't we, to kind of capture what the group had said, and there were some quite cheeky responses in the end.
Yes, yeah. When we did that voice capture, and then had ChatGPT, and then had ChatGPT like, what was the most, which group do you give the highest participation to, and like who was most provocative? So some stuff like that, but also like, what was the most common thread? So again, just that data analysis piece to help the process go faster was quite powerful.
Fabulous. Well, we might pull it up there. I think we're almost on time. But again, I just wanted to thank Sarah for the incredible report and your team. It's been really influential already, and I hope others are going to get the same value out of it. I also really want to re-thank the partners that were involved in the working group to get this work to the level that it was at. But thanks everybody for your time today. And there will be a recording that we'll be able to share around that you can extend to your colleagues, and the report is available on the AgriFutures website. Thank you very much.